Many have expressed profound concern over the changes which have been imposed on the Catholic Church since the end of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. These concerns are met with a standard reply: do not be alarmed. Nothing essential has been changed. However, if one establishes a reference point and uses it as a basis to measure the effects of the Second Vatican Council and what followed the Second Vatican Council, I believe the conclusion is unavoidable. Something essential has been changed. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. With me to discuss a Catholic boyhood in the not-too-distant past are Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio; Father Clarence Kelly, spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate in Round Top, New York; and Pat Buchanan, syndicated columnist, commentator, and co-host of CNN's Crossfire. Pat, in your book, right from the beginning, you mention the role of the Legion of Decency, how this Catholic organization would deem that a certain movie does not meet Catholic moral standards, and if a violating theater would show such a movie, an economic boycott would follow. What happened to this?
I don't know. Well, my experience with the Legion of Decency was they just started the Washington newspaper, the Catholic Standard, I think in the late 40s, 1940s. And it had the Legion of Decency, and it listed all the films, and it graded them A, I think it was sort of B, B minus, and C for condemned originally. And if we were going to go to a movie up at the Avalon Theater, which was a neighborhood theater, my father would look it up on the list and say, this is acceptable and this is not. And the startling thing about it was some of the movies that were verboten. One, I think, was The Moon is Blue. I think it was William Holden. And it gave a sympathetic portrayal, as I recall it, of divorce and remarriage. And it was condemned. And there were denunciations of it from the pulpit, and there were pickets down at the Avalon Theater. I remember in the 40s, I guess The Outlaw, the Jane Russell film, was considered the outrageous film of the era, and it was totally condemned. And it was almost for 10 years people would talk about that, how horrible that film was. It would probably be acceptable for 7-year-olds today. But exactly. I don't know what. I don't know when exactly it faded away. My guess would be right around the early 60s, but I'm not sure the exact date.
I think you're right.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, and what strikes me is I can remember as a kid taking the Legion of Decency when I was about 8, 9 years old in church. Right. The whole parish did. But here's the irony. Not too long ago, priests would get from the pulpit and say, we must boycott that theater. They shouldn't. This is a bad movie. It's leading souls to hell. What happens today? Let alone bad movies, they show blasphemous movies like The Last Temptation of Christ or the Hail Mary. Do the priests say you should picket it? No, they say don't do anything. Don't picket. If you try to make a protest, you're discouraged. Has something essential been changed?
Well, I'll tell you this, that they showed The Last Temptation of Christ at the old Avalon Theater. And I will say this, you know who picketed? Joe Gibbs, coach of the Washington Redskins, was up there marching outside that theater.
Wow.
Let me tell you, I remember when that first came out, I was down at the Democratic Convention in Atlanta, and we brought in, I think we brought in Don Wildman from Mississippi to be on that show, and we had a terrific show on that and really condemned that. I don't recall a Crossfire show that's gotten a more favorable reaction from people out there who said this is just blasphemous and outrageous. So again, the heart of this country is good, and people are deeply offended by that, but what happened to the original Legion of Decency? I don't know.
And what's, go ahead.
There doesn't seem to be any Catholic leadership, though, to condemn these things. And I remember in Cincinnati when that movie came out, the Archbishop there actually discouraged Catholics from showing any contempt for the show or try to turn people away from it, because they said it's just drawing attention to it. It seems to be the attitude these days. Well, I don't see how one could focus any more attention than the media was already giving it. It was a pretty lame excuse, but there just doesn't seem to be any voice condemning something as wrong, and the aftermath of what you were saying there this is leading souls to hell. You never hear talk like that anymore.
Well, that's the phrase you used. You don't hear that phrase. You don't even hear that from the pulpit very much these days.
Well, you know, you wonder if they even believe in souls. I mean, actions speak louder than words. But, you know, going hand in hand with these films are magazines and books. I mean, this is just proliferated to such a degree, and it assaults the youngest children, and when they shouldn't even be thinking about these things, they're just bombarded by it. I can remember an incident in your book where you and your brothers and some friends went to a magazine store, and
we were looking at sports magazines. And I don't want to recommend that kind of conduct. My brother said, "Look at all this stuff over here," and took out a lighter.
And he normally didn't smoke.
He didn't smoke, and he lit it on fire. And we're all looking at the sports magazine. You look down, and all these magazines are blazing up right on M Street over there in Georgetown now. And we just closed our magazines, walked by, and started running up the street.
But the fact, and then even you went on to mention about the case of a fellow who was mildly retarded and worked for the post office, and he was a Catholic. Right. And at one point, he had some bad magazines that the yuppies subscribed
Playboy
to.
magazines, and he's a nice fellow. He's mildly retarded, and he's been a neighborhood fellow. He still is out there. I see him if you go up to Blessed Sacrament Church, but he got a job in the post office. And, of course, he had to deliver all that consignment of Playboys one month. He looked at it and said, "This is immoral stuff," so he took all the Playboys and dumped them down a sewer. He was the postman. And so the people in the parish, though, thought they thought it was a wonderful story. It didn't bother them in the least.
Right. And what would happen if someone
At least he had his values in order, huh?
Yeah. What would happen if someone did that today?
Yeah.
Well, that's the social gospel. The very phrase that you used before, the salvation of soul. I mean, that's the supreme law of the church, the salvation of souls. But if you think of the function of the church is to provide merely for temporal security or temporal prosperity, your focus is on this earth. Your focus is not on eternity. And if your focus is on this earth, then you don't think of things like that in terms of their eternal consequences. You begin to look upon them as being prudish things, or things from the past that are really irrelevant to the modern mentality, which is earth-directed rather than heaven-directed, with the realization that there really is a hell, and that if a person dies in a state of mortal sin, they will lose their souls.
Certainly the focus today is not on eternal salvation, but on temporal salvation. And the modern church that came out of Vatican II is much more concerned about social programs and government programs as the salvation of the citizenry than they're concerned about saving immortal souls.
You know, what was it back when I first went in the conservative movement, they had the phrase, "Don't let them emanatize the eschaton." In other words, don't let them take the things of the next world and really try to say that it can be done right here on this earth.
Right.
And it was exactly, and that's exactly what's happened. Amazing.
Exactly
yeah.
what's happened.
And you know, the interesting thing on a lot of this pornography and things, especially these magazines, the most militant people standing up against it in many cases are feminists. They feel it is degrading to women. Of course, they're exactly right. But it's astonishing when they're the ones that are protesting it loudest.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And but that's the truth.
Talk about things being upside down. Right?
Yeah.
You know, something else which is, I think, indicative of a very profound change since the end of the Vatican Council regarding prayer. In your book, you mentioned that it was a normal thing. After you had dinner, you said the family rosary. And if someone who was even not a Catholic was in, come on, join in. We're going to say the rosary today. How many Catholics today say the family rosary?
Well, I don't know. I'd ask the...
A lot of the families I know say,
yeah.
but obviously in terms of the general population.
Well, I remember, I
nominal
think
Catholics,
we
very
went
few.
down when my father, of course, we had 9 kids, and each of us would lead a decade of the rosary. And when they had Father Patrick Peyton had the rosary hour? What was it called? The rosary
On the radio?
No, but he had that. But he had a crusade. He took it around the country, and he came down here to Washington D.C. There were about 50,000 people out on the monument grounds. I remember it was the biggest demonstration I'd seen there before I went into the Nixon White House, and then they got a lot larger for different purposes. You know.
But I would say, Julius, in my experience, and I'm sure in Father Jenkins' experience, that a very substantial number of the families that attend the traditional Mass on a regular basis do in fact say the family rosary. I would say a significant number.
But you know, there's really a divide between the 1950s and the late 1960s and 70s. And I think the time of the divide is right at the Vatican Council. And people who said, well, Pat, if it was so good in those days in the 1950s and faith was so strong, how could they have given birth, if you will, or ushered in the 1960s? And it's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. And my view, and I think it's Jim Hitchcock's, is that Vatican II was hijacked in a lot of ways. But it seems to me, at first, I've never been able to appreciate or understand the necessity for a Vatican II council, at least from the standpoint of the United States of America and the condition the church was in. And certainly subsequent to that, whatever the documents of Vatican II contain, the interpretation and construction that a lot of modernists have put on it, it seemed to me have been utterly contradictory to what went before.
Well, Vatican II, of course, lends itself to modernist interpretation, and certainly it was hijacked.
Because of ambiguity.
Because of its ambiguity, sure. Studied ambiguity. But also, the clergy was prepared well before Vatican II. If you go back and look at the seminary curriculum and what was taught to the priests back then, and I've known quite a few older priests, and I've talked to them about what they were studying in those days. And there were large portions of Catholic dogma, or doctrine, that they had very little knowledge of. The social doctrine of the Church, for example, doesn't seem to have been taught at all. The social kingship of Christ and so on. And this is one telling gap I've noticed in just about every older traditional priest I've known. I think that left them ripe for this. Also, if you look back at the liturgical magazines that were being published back in the 40s and 50s, they were in the hands of modernists, like Annibale Bonini, who saw the new Mass through from its inception. He was very prominent in these periodicals back then, and I think the clergy was being prepared so that when the changes came, the people were basically hostages, and even though they might resist, they had nowhere to go.
But I'll tell you, I certainly didn't, if you mentioned that in the part of the priests, the Jesuits I recall both in high school and college, I didn't get any of that. You got almost the exact opposite from the ones that I remember, you know. In high school, the misters, as we called them, the Jesuits right up the street in Gonzaga, the misters and the Jesuit fathers, they all seemed to me to be as strictly orthodox as they could be, and you know, quite militant about it.
Did they resist the changes then?
I don't know. I don't know exactly. Well, I can say some of them. I think clearly accepted the changes because I know some of them now that are.
Were also very, very orthodox and very strong in the faith. But there was a softness there. There was a soft spot so the liturgical revolution could come through, and with that, everything else fell with it.
Personally, the reason I think that it was so successful is because it was imposed by...
Revolution from above?
From above. You could take very good and decent people, good and decent priests, who are very conscious of obeying legitimate authority.
Right.
And legitimate authority comes out and says, well, you know, you should do this and you should do that. The logical conclusion is that it must be okay because legitimate authority says it is okay. So I personally think that that's the reason it was so successful, because it was imposed gradually and it was imposed from above, and therefore people just automatically assumed. I mean, we had some of the greatest popes in the history of the Church, you know, St. Pius X and Pius XII and Leo XIII, and these are the popes of recent memory, and no one ever dreamed. I don't think so, anyway.
But do you think it happened, you know, under Pius XII?
No. In other words, the attitude that a Catholic would have is say, well, look at this pope. We have a great pope, and you know, he's the one who declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and he made St. Pius X a saint. That you logically think that anything, even in his successors, that comes down from above would necessarily be in the best interest of the Church, even if it doesn't seem to be.
And you know, there are some things which were unseen, but were nevertheless present. You know, St. Pius X, upon his suppression of the modernists, was congratulated upon the success of this purge, of this disease from the Church, and he said, you know, don't be too quick to congratulate me, because I think in the latter half of the 20th century, the modernist will destroy the Catholic Church, which is a very chilling and kind of a prophetic remark that he did make.
The remark was that Paul VI said the smoke of hell has entered the vestibule of the Church.
Right, the smoke of Satan has entered.
But the question I've always asked is, the Pope has supreme authority in and the Catholic Church I grew up in. Pius XII was a figure of extraordinary authority. He commanded total respect for everything he said, and when he spoke, the moral authority of the Church was enormous in the hierarchy, and
especially in America.
In America, especially. If the bishops had told someone to vote for or against someone in those days, that would have been it. But you wonder why Paul VI, I guess, or John the 23rd died during the council, but why Paul VI or even the present Pope hasn't...
Well, when John the 23rd called the council, he was warned by a number of cardinals that he should not do it, because they sensed that the revolutionaries were in the wings just waiting to move in and to take over. And John the 23rd, in his opening speech to the council, characterized these people as prophets of gloom, and we shouldn't listen to the prophets of gloom. But apparently those prophets of gloom really did see that behind the scenes there were the liberals and maybe even some of the radicals, especially the German bishops, for example, who had their agenda. And as soon as the council was convened, they in a certain sense took over.
You know, what is peculiar is the Church was actually anticipating this happening for well over 100 years. As Pope Pius IX had a document published, it came to be called the Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, and it was taken by the troops, the Austrian troops who came into the Papal States to quell an uprising there back in the early 1800s. And it prescribed there for the secret societies to infiltrate the seminaries and the convents with the objective that they would eventually surround the Pope and that they would influence him, and that hopefully they could even get a Pope who had a very, very, let's say an idea or a thought pattern that was similar to the secret societies, the Masons. Now, as I say, this sounds very apocalyptic, but Pope Pius IX himself had this document made public by one of the greatest Jesuit historians of the day, Father Jacques Crétinaux-Joly. So they predicted that the time would come when the very See of Peter would be under siege.
We're discussing a Catholic boyhood in the not-too-distant past. I'd like to remind you, Pat, you mentioned in your book how it was a very standard practice in a Catholic boy in a school to put, or a Catholic girl, to put on your homework papers or any of your papers, AMDG, Ad Maiorem Deo Gloria. How come we never see this anymore, or very, very rarely? And what kind of a belief did that reflect?
Well, it was mainly, I guess my father was the one that suggested or recommended it when you were a kid, and you put it on your papers in school and all your test papers, and half the kids in the class would put that or JMJ at the top of the paper, and it was just. It was like it was as normal as making the sign of the cross before taking a foul shot. I mean, it was it was not only Catholic faith; it was a totally Catholicized culture that you lived in. And when the more you think back on it, I mean, you went to Mass every day because it was right before school. You'd come trooping in with your lunch bag during Mass, and then of course you went on Sundays. You went to confessions on Saturdays. You went to all the, during Holy Week when you're an altar boy, you're up there every single day. It's and the number of days you're up there in that church, when you think of it, was unbelievable.
And even
it would circle and visits, sure, after school, and it was really tremendous. And of course, all the holy days of obligation, and it was really you're in and out of there all the time, and your parents were in and out of there all the time. It was school, church, and home was the triangle, and even all your sports were Catholic youth organization, and it really was a Catholic a ghetto. And I've run into some people. It's strange. There are two people. They come out of that culture, and that some of them just love it and recall it, and they tell all these stories, and they love the book. And I've talked to others. Some of them, and many of them are women. They're very, very bitter about the experience, and they're bitter about the nuns, but. To me, it was all just, the memories were all fond.
Wonderful.
And the wonderful memories, sure, you cherish them all your lives, and the stories, and even whatever happened that you were unhappy about seems to disappear, and you just you remember the good things.
And you know what was right and wrong, and you know why you were here, you knew where you were going, you knew how to get there.
Exactly, you were really stability, and you're right inside a framework. And yeah.
But many of the people who are listening to this program would say that this was exceptional because they're too young to remember what it was like before the changes. But you're saying this was the common lot of a Catholic school student back then.
It was taken for granted that you went to church every day before you went to school, and I never had a lay teacher. I guess we wouldn't even know what to call them. We had nuns. Nuns every single grade from 1st grade through 8th grade. I never had a teacher who was not a nun. And going through high school, occasionally you would have a lay teacher for math or something like that, but mainly it was the Jesuit misters and the Jesuits, and the same was true over at Georgetown. And you were totally enveloped in a Catholic upbringing. And it was a Catholic ghetto, but everybody was delighted to live in it.
In the ghetto.
And in that particular ghetto, and as a matter of fact, people on the outside were tremendously interested in it. Protestant kids in the neighborhood, they'd ask, "Could you take me into the church?" And it was an amazing time. This is the 40s and the 50s. And it's sort of, in a way, gone with the wind. You know, the way...
I just spoke to a woman on the phone who called the day before yesterday. She was a Japanese woman. She was raised in Japan. She was a Buddhist. But she watched the Catholics, the Japanese Catholics, and she was just impressed with everything they did. Just for example, like with the rosary beads, she was attracted to it. And she started to go to Mass every morning. She was a little Buddhist. She would walk 20 minutes to Mass every morning.
Right.
And eventually, of course, she was converted.
You know, even after World War II, a lot of these guys came home after seeing what they had seen, and the conversions were tremendous. They were constantly. There was always somebody in the new conversions in the parish. I remember the maid that was at our house, converted to Catholic, was baptized right up at our church. You know, she simply worked in our household, and it was remarkable.
You know, you mentioned your experience with the nuns who you recall fondly. How often does one even see a Catholic nun who wears a full habit today? How many young nuns are there? Very few. And what the other thing which struck me was you mentioned how Sister Thomasina once approached you in grade school and said, "Pat, I want you to come here." And she said, "Well, you know, see this, do you know this man, Pat?" And you said this was Paul Blanchard.
He's still giving us trouble, I think, isn't he?
And she said, "You know, you must answer, you must defend the faith." And you were encouraged to do this. And today, does this ever happen?
Yeah, it was, well, it was remarkable. Yeah.
You know, Pat, when I left the modern seminaries, I'd been there for quite a few years, and came back, I wound up teaching religion in the very school from which I had graduated 8th grade. It was a Catholic school at one time. And I gave those children basic catechism questions. And the only answer I got to one question, for example, name the 7 sacraments, was from one girl, and she ventured one answer, and that was, one of the 7 sacraments was holy confusion. This was back in the
well, you know, we used to
in the mid-70s.
The Baltimore Catechism, you were instructed, and not only that, we had, as I mentioned in the book, something based on the old the old whiz kids. And we would go downtown, the best
Catechism
students, the catechism, the best students from the school, we'd go downtown, you go on this little Catholic radio program, and they would quiz you on it, and you had to have every single word right. Not only simply make all the points, every single word and the answer right, and they'd have contests back and forth.
You know, you were mentioning too that between, say, 1941, I believe, and 1961, the Catholic population doubled. The conversions were just tremendous, Protestants and non-believers becoming Catholics. And in fact, I think one of the cardinals at the time, was it Spellman or another one, said that, well, at this rate, this is going to be a Catholic country by,
55%, I think, of the population growth in America in those years, I think, was Catholic. And Catholic families were growing, of course, and the number of conversions was tremendous.
You know, another thing which is totally forgotten today is the idea of expiatory suffering. I mean, it sounds like a big word, but your dad mentioned when, say, you got some physical pain, you'd say, offer it up. What did he mean by that?
Well, he meant offer up, stop griping, stop whining and complaining, act like a man, and offer it up for the suffering souls in purgatory. And that's if, take your pain and deal with it well and offer it up, basically, and to help some of the souls in purgatory get out.
Could you imagine if you told something like this to a priest just out of the seminary, he'd look at you like you're
Is
crazy.
that true, Father?
Depends on the seminary.
Yeah. But you know, let me tell you a story. It's, you know, my father was a rock, really, of the church, and what happened to him was that his father sort of ran off when he was about 8 or 10 years old, and he just never forgot it his whole life. He said he used to see a red-headed man on the street, he'd run up and see if it was his father. And the Jesuits up here at Gonzaga came by the house one day when he was going to go, his mother was going to send him, they didn't have any money, to Western High School or McKinley Tech. And this Jesuit came up to the house and said, why isn't he going to Gonzaga? And she said, we don't have any money. And he said, we don't want your money, we want your son. And so they just took him down there, and I mean, they created an individual and his whole family that came out of all that decision, that devotion to him. And it was, I'm sure there was a great measure of gratitude and respect and affection. But I think Gonzaga did it. It had to, because he didn't even go to college. But I think he went 1 year, and he couldn't afford to go anymore. So it was here, I mean, right there at Gonzaga.
Then he finished up later on, though.
Well, and during World War II,
Right.
he had about 4 kids at his graduation, yeah, after night school.
Thank you for a delightful half hour. We're out of time. You've been watching What